Welcome to our ClimTip webinar series. For those who are new, ClimTip is a European research project on uncertainty-aware quantification of climate tipping points. And we have this webinar series to talk about various parts of the science around it. Today, we're going to look at the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation with Maya Ben-Yami. And I would give the word to Nicholas to introduce our guest speaker.
Yes, thank you. And also Maya, thank you. Maya present today. I'm very much looking forward to this. I'm excited. So Maya studied in Cambridge University, physics and mathematics, where she graduated, and I think then spent a year or so at ESA before she joined us as a PhD student. In the Critical Earth Horizon 2020 Innovative Training Network, and has since then focused on different aspects of related to AMOC, including uncertainty quantification for stability loss and the sort of do's and don'ts, like how far can we go in analyzing stability changes in the AMOC and what that can tell us for possible future tipping times. But also very thorough work on the possible impacts if an AMOC collapse were to happen, with focus on the tropical monsoon systems. And I guess that is also what we're going to hear about today. And yeah, so very much looking forward to this, Maya. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you both for the introduction. So yeah, like Nicholas said, I'm Maya, and I'm going to be talking on a topic sort of similar to what we had last month in this seminar, the talk from Yeshul on sort of like AMOC warning signals. But instead of focusing on sort of one particular in-depth work, I'm sort of going to give you an overview of a few different results, like Nicholas said, related both to the impact of an AMOC collapse and the uncertainties associated with sort of warning and prediction of such a collapse. And so sort of the outline for today is, first, I'll give a really quick introduction to what the AMOC is, if there's any of you here in the audience who aren't that familiar with it. Then we'll talk a bit about why we're worried about the AMOC collapsing, like what the impacts are of such an event, and then go on to sort of like warning signals that we can get for a collapse from historical data, and then the sort of uncertainties surrounding actually getting a specific time for when such a collapse might happen. So to start, what is the AMOC? It stands for Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation. And basically the AMOC is what you see here on the right in this figure. It's a current system in the Atlantic Ocean where you have these warm in red surface currents traveling from the South Atlantic to the north. And here, because they get more to the north, they cool down, get denser, sink down in sort of dense deep water formation regions, and then travel back south as this blue arrow, this cold, dense, deep water. And the important thing to know about the AMOC is that these current system overall, they transport heat and salt northward across the Atlantic. And something that I've taken to sort of like highlighting about the AMOC to give an idea of like why this is such an important system is that the AMOC is actually special. If you had a complete ocean planet, you wouldn't have an AMOC. So it actually comes about from a sort of combination of like the geometry of the Atlantic basin, the fact that we have an Atlantic circumpolar current on this planet, and the fact that the Atlantic is saltier. So actually in the Pacific, there's no sort of like cross-equatorial circulation like the AMOC. So this is actually a circulation that is quite special and really forms the climate that we have today on the planet, which is why we're also worried about what will happen to the AMOC in the future, specifically with the climate warming. In the sort of subpolar North Atlantic here, you get warming, you get more rainfall as the climate changes, and you also have melting ice from sea ice and also from glaciers such as on Greenland ice sheet. And all of this combines, you know, there's fresher water, there's warmer water, so it's lighter, there's less sinking, less convection, less deep water formation. And basically what we see also in also in the models is that the AMOC weakens with future climate change. This is from sort of like the IPCC report using data from CMIP6 models. You can see that across sort of different future scenarios, the AMOC gets weaker. And if you extend these projections sort of in a few different models past 2100, you can see that the AMOC even sort of reaches zero in some models, or almost zero, basically collapses. And the reason that we're talking about this in the ClimTip seminar, and that we're even more worried about the AMOC, is because the AMOC is sort of theorized to have a tipping point or be a tipping element. And what you can see here is the AMOC in a model where basically you add fresh water to the North Atlantic, and then at some point you have a sort of small perturbation in the freshwater, and the AMOC collapses to a different state. And this is sort of worrying also, because then if you sort of try to reverse this effect, you don't immediately go back to the state you were in. But basically, if this was true of the AMOC in sort of, practical human timescales, a collapse of the AMOC could be irreversible. Okay, to structure this presentation, I'll just go over the fact that we have a lot of open questions about the AMOC nowadays. We're still not certain that it can actually tip because of global warming. There is evidence that the AMOC has sort of had abrupt changes in the past, but will it be able to sort of undergo an abrupt transition in the future? That's still a question. And if yes, we're still not certain exactly what temperature is the sort of point of no return for the AMOC, or even if there is an exact temperature. And the question that I will sort of, be focusing on more in this presentation is this question of what will happen when the AMOC collapses. Has it already been approaching its collapse since 1950? Is this AMOC already losing stability? And can we actually, predict exactly when the AMOC will collapse from what we know about its history? So starting with the impact of an AMOC collapse, basically, to have a very simple schematic of what happens when we sort of turn off the AMOC and don't have it around anymore, this heat transport that I was talking about before, where the AMOC transports heat from the south to the north, that sort of weakens or even turns off. And so you have cooling in the northern hemisphere and a bit of warming in the southern hemisphere. And obviously, so this is not great for, life in the oceans, or even, it would get colder around, North America or Europe. But as we know from climate change, temperature changes don't mean only temperature changes, right? So this sort of cooling also has a big influence on rainfall across the globe. So what you can see here on the top left is sea surface temperatures across 1 year. And then on the bottom right is precipitation, global precipitation across the same year. And you can see that you have this sort of intense band of tropical precipitation here. It sort of corresponds roughly to the intertropical convergence zone, which is the region where the trade winds converge. And basically, there's a few different ways to sort of look at this band, but I like to think of it as also around the oceans, basically happening above the location of warmest sea surface temperatures, right? So you can see that as the sea surface temperatures on this sort of top left animation move up and down, so does the rainfall here on the bottom right. And you can already imagine that if we sort of change the temperature structure of the globe and of the ocean, if we sort of move the location of warmest temperatures a bit to the south because of this decrease in heat transport, you also have this band of rainfall moving to the south. So the way that we can sort of test what impact an AMOC collapse would have is with something called hosing experiments. Basically, we take climate models and artificially add fresh water to the North Atlantic. Obviously, there's no actual hose in this experiment. It's just a sort of nice way to think about it. For those of you who are familiar with sort of the idea of bifurcation diagram for the AMOC, this is just a simple double fold, but just to illustrate, a hosing experiment would be basically pushing the AMOC into this sort of direction in the bifurcation diagram, where there you wait for a few years for it to sort of, collapse to this weak state. And then when you turn off the hosing, you go back to the same sort of original freshwater forcing. If you stay in this sort of weak collapse state, you've basically found an alternative AMOC stable state. Obviously, to do this properly, you'd need to wait for a long time, but even if it sort of like remains here for a few hundred years, that already says something. And specifically, I use the results from the North Atlantic Hosing Model Intercomparison project, where here you can see the 4 models that I took from this experiment, for this intercomparison project, where the black line on the figures now is the pre-industrial control, right? So no forcing. Then we have the hosing, where the AMOC weakens. And after 50 or 100 years of hosing, the hosing is stopped, and you have this sort of like stable AMOC weak state in the models. And basically, by comparing the black line to the orange line, you know, the different impacts, you can sort of find out what's happened when the AMOCs collapsed. And as we've talked about before, the impacts for temperature are very clear, which is this cooling over the whole of the northern hemisphere. But you can see that the sort of strength of the impact is different between different models, and it's sort of the amount of cooling is proportional to how much the AMOC weakens here, right? So you can see in CAN-ESM the difference between the strong and weak AMOC isn't so big, and then in CSM it is a big difference, and that is also reflected in how much cooling there is in these models. And similarly, we can also have a look at what happens to the precipitation. So here, green is more precipitation, brown is less. And you can see that basically south of the equator, you get more precipitation, and then on the north, you get less, which is this sort of like southward shift of the tropical precipitation band that I talked about before. Again, stronger in the models with a stronger difference between the 2 AMOC strengths. So the cool thing about these experiments is that not only do we see sort of like the effects of an AMOC collapse, but also they agree between models. So before this intercomparison project, there was sometimes a lot of disagreement between the results of like different models for different hosing experiments. But here, basically what this figure is showing is all the colored regions are the regions where all 4 models agree on the sign of change, right? So all the blue regions is where all the models agree that an AMOC collapse would cause more rainfall over the annual mean, and the red region is less rainfall over the annual mean. And this is sort of like an agreement across the globe, really. And similarly, if we look at changes sort of in the seasonal cycle, right, sort of change in each month, so now a darker color basically means that the number of models number of months where all 4 models agree is higher. So you can see that there you have even dark regions where sort of almost all models, the models agree in almost all months. Sorry, I sort of get confused about this model month comparison. And the reason that this sort of seasonal agreement is important is because the impacts of an AMOC collapse can be pretty strong in the regions that we sometimes call monsoon regions. So I talked about this sort of like band of rainfall moving north and south before, and sort of there's a few different ways to define monsoon regions, but you can think of them for this presentation as regions on the globe where the seasonal changes in sort of rainfall, atmospheric circulation, precipitation are associated with this sort of like IPCZ moving in and out or through these regions. And so in our research, we sort of looked at 4 specific monsoon regions: the South American monsoon here, sort of going across the North and Southern Amazon, the West African monsoon, Indian summer monsoon, and East Asian summer monsoon. And for these regions, because these regions are sort of characterized by very sort of like strong seasonal shifts and important sort of like, you know, wet seasons and dry seasons, we also wanted to see not only what happens sort of like on the mean with AMOC changes, but also on the seasonal sort of level. But before I show you that, I do want to highlight that even here in these sort of regions, we do have sort of a strong agreement between the models, even in comparison to other experiments. So what you can see here in this orange triangle is from a scale to 0.1, sort of the top row is how much the 4 models sort of agree geographically, and then the bottom row is how much they agree sort of on this monthly scale, right? So out of the 12 months, and how many of them do they agree on the sign of change? And you can see that this sort of hosing in the orange triangle is there's usually more agreement there than for the CO2 experiments, different sort of future forcing experiments and forced time CO2 experiments. This is not to say, anything special. It's just that, you want a benchmark for agreement, right? What counts for good model agreement? And so we compared this to other sort of like experiments, and we saw that the agreement in these hosing experiments between the 4 models are pretty good. So basically, we went to look at the sort of change in dry and wet season length. So what you see here on the map are these 4 monsoon regions. And the red colors are basically the places where you have like longer dry seasons. So red is bad, blue is good, sort of in that approximation. And you can see that for somewhere like the West African monsoon, across the region, you have an increase in in the dry season length, somewhere even in some regions, even like more than 0.5 months longer dry season. And similarly in the Indian summer monsoon, East Asian summer monsoon, you mostly have this sort of increase in the dry season length. But in the Amazon and the South American monsoon, you see more of sort of like a difference between the 2 regions above and below the equator, right? Longer dry season above the equator, shorter below. So we'll get to why that is a bit later. But first, we can also look at the wet season length change, right? Here, sort of the red is bad, so it's a shorter wet season, and the blue is good, so it's longer wet season. The West African monsoon, Indian summer monsoon, East Asia summer monsoon, they sort of have the similar pattern then for the dry season length change, where you have a shorter wet season. The white regions here in West Africa, in the Sahara, is because basically there's no wet season, so there's nothing to change. But here again, for the Amazon, we see a more complicated response where we don't even see this sort of like above below equator thing, but mostly just a longer wet season, even though the dry season is much longer as well in some regions. And so to understand why it's a bit different here for the South American monsoon, we have to sort of look at what happens to the seasonal cycle itself, not just the sort of like wet and dry season length. And so first I'm going to show you here a relatively simple effect, which is what happens to the West African monsoon. So here, basically, you have the 4 models for this sort of region here in West Africa. And what you can see happening in these plots is sort of the x-axis is the months, and you see the red is sort of a decrease in rainfall. You can't really, there would be a blue if there was an increase in rainfall, but here all you see is this sort of red decrease in rainfall. It's bigger in some models than others, again, proportional to the AMOC change, and it's biggest sort of here in the wet season, like this. And the way you can understand this is if you look up here on this sort of like animation we had before, where you can see approximately the same sort of like box as we use in our analysis, you can see this rain band, this dark blue band sort of coming in and out of this box. So what happens when you have an AMOC collapse is that this whole band shifts more to the south. So it still comes sort of into this box, but it stays less time and sort of goes less further into the box, right? So you sort of, instead of going in and out for like, I don't know, 4 months, it goes in and out for 3 months, and less of the band is actually inside the box. So that's why it's quite simple. You just have longer dry season, less rainfall. But for this box here in the northern South American monsoon or the northern Amazon, you can see here first on the sort of animation on the top right, I hope it's big enough, that this sort of like dark blue band, it doesn't just come in and out, it sort of comes in, goes out, and then comes in and goes out again during 1 year. So it's sort of, because this box is right on the sort of middle path of the current sort of path of this tropical rain belt, when this whole rain belt shifts to the south, we don't just simply have less rainfall, but we actually have what you see here, which is a shift of the seasonal cycle to later in the year. So here you see the decrease in rainfall is quite strong, but then you have sort of a strong increase in rainfall later in the year. And it's because basically you have like, this is the seasonal cycle before the AMOC collapse, and then this is the seasonal cycle after the AMOC collapse. So it's basically shifting about 3 months later in the year. And so that's why overall, the sort of like overall rainfall change might not be that big, but it still could have quite catastrophic effect on local sort of like ecosystems or even on sort of societies. Because if you're a tree and you're sort of like, you know, using the sun to know when the rain season is going to come, and then the rainy season actually comes 3 months later, that could be quite problematic. And also if you're a person, you know, who sort of your livelihood depends on the rainy season coming at the right time and not later in the year. So, okay. To recap this sort of first section on the impacts of an AMOC collapse, obviously there's a lot of other impacts on sort of, you know, sea level height, like heat waves, things like that. But here I focused on the fact that you have this southward shift of the tropical rain belt, which causes this overall drying in the West African monsoon, the Indian summer monsoon, and East Asian summer monsoon. And then for the Amazon, it has this more sort of like complicated effect where in the southern Amazon you have this like increase in rainfall and shorter dry season, but in the northern Amazon we see this sort of like shift of the seasonal cycle to later in the year, as we could see here, where basically it does increase dry season length and severity, but the sort of annual precipitation doesn't change that much. And if you want to read more, in these recap sections, I'll also have like QR codes linking to the papers that have these results. And I'll also have these QR codes at the end. So don't worry if you don't sort of manage to catch them. Okay, so now that we've talked about why an AMOC collapse is something to be worried about, why this is something that, you know, we should be concerned about, let's talk about, you know, warning of an AMOC collapse. Can we know if we're actually like getting closer to something like this? And so the one way that we can sort of like warn of an approaching tipping point is with a process called critical slowing down, which happens to dynamical systems when they approach a tipping or bifurcation point. You can see this happening on the bottom in this sort of like double fold bifurcation system, where basically as the system approaches the sort of like bifurcation point, transition to the alternative stable state, you can see that the potential well becomes shallower and wider. And so the recovery time from perturbations increases because the sort of, you can think of it as the movements of this ball sort of like going more and more from side to side. And you have this restoring rate increasing. Yes, and that also comes with a variance and autocorrelation increase, basically because this negative restoring rate becomes lower. Okay. So Niklas already sort of looked at the critical slowing down for the AMOC in sort of observational fingerprints in 2021. And you can see here on the bottom, these sort of increases in the restoring rate, both for city surface temperature and salinity-based AMOC fingerprints. And also he sort of looked at this sort of grid cell by grid cell analysis, where for every sort of grid cell in the Atlantic Ocean, you have a look at, you know, what's happening to the restoring rate, and you find increases in areas that are associated with the AMOC. So this is sort of like quite a worrying result, but there's still some questions around it because using critical slowing down for the AMOC does have some uncertainties. And here I'm sort of going to focus on the sort of uncertainties that are related to measuring the AMOC. First of all, the fact that since we don't have direct measurements of the AMOC before could like sort of long enough, right? There's not like a constant measurements of the AMOC directly before 2004. So we need to use fingerprints, which might not represent it accurately enough. And the other problem is that these fingerprints need to use observational data sets, like a data set for sea surface temperature, for example, and these come with their own uncertainties and biases. And so first, I want to sort of like talk about the issue of using fingerprints and sort of like maybe cover one of the uncertainties that are related to this. Like I said, for something like critical slowing down, we need a really long time series. We need at least 100 years of data to sort of get a proper, you know, statistically significant increase for time a system that is as slow as the AMOC. And so basically only salinity and temperature observations go that far back. And the most sort of commonly used fingerprint for the AMOC, I call the ASSTI, the AMOC Sea Surface Temperature Index. People call it a lot of different things. Sometimes it's called the subpolar gyre index or something like that, the Caesar et al. Index, because it was introduced by Caesar et al. In 2018. There's a lot of sort of different variations of this fingerprint, but here I'm going to be talking about basically taking the subpolar gyre sea surface temperatures in this box in the Atlantic Ocean and sort of subtracting the global mean sea surface temperatures. And for example, for the ERSS-TV5 dataset, you get this sort of fingerprint for the AMOC, which is an approximation of how the AMOC has changed over the last 150 years. And if we calculate the restoring rate for this, we get this very sort of strong increase that you also saw in Nicholas's paper. But so the justification that people use for sort of using this fingerprint is that if you sort of look at climate models, and here we see results from CMIP6 models, this sort of fingerprint has a high decadal correlation with the AMOC stream function. So here the y-axis is the fingerprint's correlation with the AMOC at 35 north, and the x-axis is the correlation with the AMOC at 26.5 north, all of it in the historical runs of these CMIP6 models. You can see that there is definitely a spread in the correlations, but they are sort of clustered at this top right corner, which is like a relatively good correlation with the AMOC stream function. However, because this is not a perfect correlation, there is, always a chance that the statistical changes that we see in the ASSTI could be caused by something else, right? So this is what I like to call sort of like a physical false positive, where you get a false positive, not because, the statistical changes are sort of like, you're measuring them wrong or something, but because another sort of physical thing is affecting this fingerprint and causing this sort of like increase in the restoring rate. And for example, this could be atmospheric effects, because obviously this sort of sea surface temperature region over the subpolar gyre is influenced by the atmosphere. It could be something like ocean memory changes, where, for example, the whole sort of like over the whole ocean, you could have something like a increase in the restoring rate because of climate change. Or perhaps this critical slowing down could be connected to an upcoming subpolar gyre tipping and not an AMOC tipping, because we are using sea surface temperatures in the subpolar gyre after all. So the way that we tested this and also found some other results, but I'm going to be sort of concentrating on this sort of physical false positive thing, is looked at the CMIP6 models historical runs. We have 133 ensemble members for these models. So we have our time series, we calculate the critical slowing down indicators, restoring rate, AR1 variance, and then for each of these, we measure the slope, and we also use Fourier surrogates to get the significance of the slope. And we basically say a slope is significant if it's below 0.05 of a p-value. And so now, if all the time series were completely random, if you had no critical slowing down actually going on, then what you would expect is that at a significance level of 0.05 out of 133 time series, you would get 7 of them having significant increases, right? It just, if you have a distribution and you have this sort of like significance cutoff, you're going to get some. And you might be asking yourself, but Maya, like the observations have an increase. Wouldn't you expect that also in CMIP6 models? The issue here is a bit more complicated, because if you were here last month at Yeshul's talk, you saw that there is a CMIP6 models are thought to be a bit too stable, and actually none of them have an AMOC collapse before 2100. And it's still an open question whether this is sort of like a realistic projection or if it's to do with something like the models being too stable. But the thing here is that we wouldn't necessarily expect to see critical slowing down in these historical runs because there's no collapse before 2100. And indeed, if we look here at the statistics, basically what you see is sort of like here, the most important thing are these like pink bars where you have the restoring rate, autocorrelation variance, and the y-axis is the number of runs with significant trends out of the 133 runs, right? And the black bar here is this thing I was talking about in the previous slide, which is the expected value for 133 time series, right? The sort of value you'd expect if it was completely random. And you can see that for the ASSTI, for the autocorrelation and variance, the number of significant increases are basically at the expected value. And for the restoring rate, it's actually even less. The situation is more complicated for the stream functions. I don't want to go into it now because it's a bit more sort of like difficult to understand what's going on. But I think that the really sort of like interesting result from this is that because we don't see this sort of like basically what we see for the ASSDI is just what we would expect from like a system where like no critical slowing down is going on. That means that basically in the historical period, the ASSDI isn't prone to false positives, because I mean, the CMIP6 models, all these other effects that I was talking about before that could be causing these sort of like physical false positives, they are happening in the CMIP6 models. There are CMIP6 models with subpolar gyre collapse and they have the atmospheric effect, etc. But they don't have any critical slowing down increases. So this fingerprint it's not something that, you know, you can just easily see in this fingerprint, a critical slowing down or as an increase in the restoring rate. Okay, so now that we have a bit more trust in these fingerprints, let's have a look at the data sets that we use to calculate them. And the issue here, to really sort of like summarize it, is that when we take observations of the climate and of the ocean in particular, you have a lot of these sort of like separate, you know, like locations that you observe, and you don't observe in the same amount in different regions. This map is actually from 2001, so it's not even like that far in history. But then when you make it into a data set, you basically take all of these observations, measurements, and you sort of like make it into this sort of like smooth product where every grid cell is filled. Not all data sets do this, but mostly they do this sort of infilling in different locations. And they also sort of like correct for biases for measurements and sometimes do other sort of smoothing. And I don't want to give the impression that this is a bad thing. This is obviously the people who make these data sets are experts, but the problem is that a lot of the time what they're focusing on is the accuracy of the sort of long time mean trend, because what we're interested in the most is how much, you know, has the ocean warmed since 1850, but that can have a problematic influence on the sort of like higher order statistics like the variance, and sometimes you can have sort of like basically false sort of like trends in something like a variance because of this smoothing. So the way that we sort of like tested for these uncertainties that come from the observational data sets is sort of two different methods. The first is using the uncertainty estimates that come with the data sets. This is something where like not all data sets actually have these, and also, you know, just a tip, you always have to make sure that the uncertainty estimate does actually sort of cover what you want. But because sometimes data sets come with an uncertainty estimate, but it only covers, you know, like one parameter in something, or not the whole sort of like, you know, infilling process that we would be interested in estimating. And then the sort of second thing that we do is we estimate the significance of the trends using surrogates, as I sort of mentioned before, but we also incorporate the data processing method into the surrogates. So for example, if, you know, the data is sort of smoothed over in a specific way, we also do this to the surrogates to sort of incorporate that data processing into the calculation of our significance. And to give you an example of this, here we have that ASSTI AMOC fingerprint that I talked about before for 3 different SST datasets, HAD-SST4, HAD-CRUD5, and ERSSTV5. And what you see around the fingerprint, so the fingerprint is in black, and what you see around it is the uncertainty ensemble range that comes from the uncertainty estimates that are provided with the datasets. And if you use these uncertainty ensembles, sometimes it's a 200 members, sometimes 1,000 members, so on, to calculate also all of the restoring rate time series, you see that we also get this sort of like uncertainty range around the restoring rate. And in some cases, the sort of increase doesn't look as sharp anymore. So we can also see this if we calculate for each of these ensemble members, we calculate the trend. And so now the x-axis is basically this distribution of slopes. You can see for some data sets, it's more sort of like tightly grouped. For others, it's less. All of them are positive, but some are less and some are more. And what we're actually interested in here is not just the trend, but the significance of the trend. So for each of these sort of like increases, we use Fourier surrogates to calculate how significant this increase here. And then you can see on the bottom here, this is the distribution of p-values, right? So our sort of arbitrary sort of cutoff for significance is this gray line 0.05, but you could argue that basically what we want is just that the p-values will be grouped at a low enough value, right? And that's definitely what we see here in these figures, especially in HADA64, almost all of them are grouped below 0.05, but in the other ones as well, more than 50% of these ensemble members have a p-value below 0.05 and almost all of them below 0.1. So this is already quite a sort of good result for the significance of critical slowing down in these fingerprints. And similarly, we can also do sort of a similar thing. You know, Niklas also looked at this sort of like grid cell by grid cell analysis, where you take every grid cell in the sort of sea surface temperature data set and you calculate the restoring rate for it. And here we can also use these ensemble members, right? We can sort of calculate the restoring rate increase for each ensemble member. And then we can have a look at what regions on the map have all of the ensemble members showing a positive trend, right? And you can see this in the sort of like green dashed area, where now this sort of region in the North Atlantic is where all of the ensemble members agree that like the restoring rate is increasing. And this is sort of important because this is also the region that is associated with these sort of like AMOC currents and AMOC transport, right? So if the AMOC was sort of slowing down and affecting the sea surface temperatures, this is also where we would sort of expect to see the changes happening. And so when we did this analysis in the paper here on the bottom left, we also looked at some salinity stuff and a few other different aspects. But the sort of summary of the results is that we found that critical slowing down in SSDs and in these SSD fingerprints was still present and significant when we sort of like accounted for the uncertainties. So to recap this section, we sort of looked at some questions that might come up when you try to use critical slowing down for the AMOC. And we saw that, first of all, this sort of like ASSTI, this index of sea surface temperatures, it's not prone to critical slowing down false positives in the historical period. So like seeing CSD in this index is actually a surprising thing. And also that these signs of CSD are sort of still significant if you account for sort of what's happening in the observational data sets. And all of this together is basically just means that like this increase that we see in the restoring rate in these fingerprints and sea surface temperatures, this is not something that like would easily happen by accident. This is not something that you would expect if there wasn't something going on here, especially with the AMOC. So these results basically support that what we're seeing in these sea surface temperatures does mean that the AMOC is undergoing critical slowing down and perhaps approaching a tipping point. Okay, now that we've sort of come to this worrying result, let's see if we sort of can go on to the sort of final question, which is what everyone wants to know, right? Okay, but every time I talk to, you know, a friend of mine that isn't in climate change, they ask me, okay, but like, when is the AMOC going to collapse? Give me a number. And it's quite tempting when you have this sort of like time series, like a restoring rate increase, to be like, okay, but can I project this into the future and answer that question? Can I answer the important question of when the AMOC is going to actually cross the tipping point and collapse? And so the problem here is that this sort of prediction has the same uncertainties and more that the critical slowing down has, that we sort of discussed in the previous section. So here on the sort of the two uncertainties are on the right are the ones that I discussed before, right? The fact that we need to use fingerprints that are not like a sort of one-on-one representation of the AMOC, and that the observational data sets have uncertainties. But here, if you want to sort of like predict an AMOC tipping time, you also need to make a lot more modeling assumptions, because saying something like the AMOC is losing stability is a lot less, you need to make a less assumptions for that than if you want to say the AMOC is going to collapse at this exact time. If you want to extrapolate into the future, you basically need to make assumptions about how the system is going to evolve, right? So you need to make more assumptions here. So yeah, the reason that uncertainties matter even more for prediction than for just saying something like the AMOC has been losing stability is, first of all, because you make more assumptions, and also because it's a lot more sensitive to other uncertainties. So if you can sort of imagine sort of just having a sort of slope here and seeing where it crosses the y-axis, obviously the methods are more sort of sophisticated than this, but you can see that just slight changes in the sort of like time series could have a big effect on like where, you know, the line is crossing the y-axis. And so to investigate the effect these uncertainties have, we basically tried to sort of look at them for the maximum likelihood estimation that was introduced by Ditlevsen and Ditlevsen in 2023. And they applied this to the AMOC in a specific sea surface temperature data set and got some quite worrying sort of results for timing for an AMOC collapse. But we wanted to see, you know, what happens when we actually look at the uncertainties. And so I'm going to start off with the sort of first group, the modeling assumptions, where basically the assumptions that this maximum likelihood estimation method has is, first of all, they assume that the system can tip, right? If you want to predict a future tipping point, you need to assume that the system can tip. Then they also make the assumption that the model is a full normal form, but basically saying that it's sort of close enough to the bifurcation point that this is a good enough assumption. And they also sort of like the model assumes that the noise that is forcing the system is white, so it's uncorrelated noise, and that the forcing changes linearly, right? So the change in sort of something like warming or freshwater forcing is changing linearly. And the way we sort of tested all of these assumptions is, first of all, we built a sort of toy model where all of these hold, right? We have a full normal form forced by white noise with linear forcing. And then we ran this, you know, for a lot of different, got a lot of different time series out of this model. And then we sort of applied the maximum likelihood estimation method to it. And you can see that sort of like the true tipping time is here in a dashed black line. And the method basically predicts this tipping time, right? So it works when all of these assumptions are whole. That's good. It is a good method when all the assumptions are holding. But what happens if we break all of these assumptions, right? What happens if we have a system that basically is a linear model with red noise forcing? It can't tip, the noise isn't white. Then the issue is that because this MLE method is built to predict tipping, it's still going to predict tipping, even if you have a system that can't actually tip, right? Because you have this sort of red noise with changing correlation, the method still predicts tipping. But you might say that, like, okay, this is breaking too much, right? Like, I mean, maybe the AMOC isn't driven by, maybe not all of these assumptions hold, but like everything we've been talking about today assumes that the AMOC can tip. So let's see what happens when we just sort of force the system with red noise instead of white noise, right? So the noise has a changing autocorrelation. Then what you see is that the tipping is biased to earlier years, right? So this is dashed line is the true tipping, and then the green line is biased to earlier years. And a similar thing happens when we break the assumption that the forcing is linear. So here now you have a forcing that is slowing down with time. And actually this is not unrealistic for the AMOC, right? Because even though sort of CO2, the log of CO2 has sort of been changing linearly over the past 100 years, it's unlikely that it will continue to change linearly in the future. And also AMOC forcing is more something like freshwater, not just the temperature. And you can also break the sort of fault normal fall idea. So here we basically also used 2D Stommel-Sessi model. On the left, it's with white noise and linear forcing, and then with slowing forcing here on the right. And what you can see is, again, the sort of prediction of tipping time is biased to earlier years instead of this like true line here in the black. Okay, so we already saw that the assumptions can cause problems, but can we actually sort of like also say something about the other uncertainties? First of all, the indirect fingerprints, where here the way we test this is basically by using 3 different fingerprints. So in their paper, Ditlevsen and Ditlevsen applied the maximum likelihood estimation method to the fingerprint here, the sort of SPG minus 2 times global mean temperature. But we also wanted to test a few different AMOC fingerprints. So the 1 - 1 times global mean temperature, and also the dipole fingerprint, where you're sort of taking the northern box SSTs here minus the southern box SSTs. And also, as sort of talked about before, this is just a figure to show you these data sets that you already saw in the previous section of the presentation, these observational data sets. And what we do is we basically apply the maximum likelihood estimation method to these 3 fingerprints and these 3 data sets. And if we use the data set that Ditlevsen and Ditlevsen et al. Used in their, no et al., sorry, it's just Ditlevsen and Ditlevsen, used in their paper, the HADI SST dataset, you see that for the 3 fingerprints, the predicted tipping time is sort of bunched over here between 2000 and 2100. But from the fact that this x-axis goes up to 5000, you can probably already like guess what's going to happen. Because when we sort of applied the tipping time estimation method to the other datasets, you can see that our estimation sort of ranged from again around 2100 to here sort of like 4065. And I need to highlight here that the HADI SST isn't like a better data set than the others, right? All of these just sort of like take different approaches to infilling missing data or like bias correction. But at the end of the day, they are all good, robust sea surface temperature data sets. And yet they give completely different results for a prediction of AMOC tipping time. And as you saw before, some of these data sets also have uncertainty ensembles. So here's what happened when we used the HADCRUD5 uncertainty ensemble, right? 200 members. We estimated the tipping time for each member, and then we get these sort of huge spreads. So for the dipole fingerprint, you actually get a spread that goes all the way to 8065. And basically, this is just a result that makes this prediction not practical, right? If you want to know when the AMOC will collapse and your method tells you it might be 2050, it might be 8000, that isn't really a result that can help you understand the AMOC better or what's going to happen. So it's not that the method is bad, it's just that it's so sensitive to these uncertainties that the range that we get is so big that it's just not useful. And so the sort of conclusion and recap of this section is that tipping time prediction requires a lot more assumptions. And so something like just having a red noise or non-linear forcing in the system, which isn't unlikely to happen, you know, for the AMOC in the real world, that can already quite bias the tipping time. And just using different fingerprints and SST datasets for the AMOC gives this huge range of predicted tipping times. So the conclusion of this, like I said, is that using historical data, we can't really predict the AMOC tipping time. And if you sort of want to look over at this paper that we published, basically, we discuss why this is true for basically all Earth system elements. So sort of predicting tipping time from historical data is just not practical, given the uncertainties and limitations that we have. Okay, so I think I'm just in time to get to the conclusions, which is great. So we went over a lot today, and I'm going to just take a moment to conclude all of this, which first of all, we looked at sort of the impacts that the collapse of the AMOC would have, which here focusing specifically on what would happen to monsoon systems, where basically we saw that like it would have negative impacts on the Indian summer monsoon, East Asian summer monsoon, West African summer monsoon, and a more complex shift of the seasonal cycle in the northern Amazon and an increase in rainfall in the southern Amazon. So we also saw that in CMIP6 models, the sort of AMOC SST index that is used to look at changes for the AMOC, it's not prone to physical false positives in the restoring rate increase in the sort of critical slowing down indicators. So that should definitely be added here, because just saying this doesn't really tell you what sort of false positives it is. So yeah, and also we saw that basically, even when we sort of look at what's happening with the observational data sets that we use for these fingerprints for the AMOC, the sort of changes that we see in the statistics are still significant when you account for sort of the data set biases and uncertainties. And these two combined sort of like strengthen the indication that like what we see happening in these SSTs mean that the AMOC is losing its stability. But we saw that even though these sort of like uncertainties don't have like are still not enough to sort of like disprove the fact that the AMOC is losing stability, they are enough to sort of like cause enough uncertainty in a tipping time prediction to make it not feasible. So we can say something like the AMOC has been losing stability, has been approaching a tipping point, but we aren't able to predict exactly when the AMOC will tip. So with that, I've reached the end of the presentation. Thank you for listening. And if you want to read more about any of these results, we have 3 published papers and 1 still under review here, which you can see in these QR codes. Okay, and I think for questions, Kuat, yes, are you going to?
Yes, thank you so much, Maya. Yeah, we can open the floor for questions. I'm happy that you gave this talk today because we were planning it last year, right? In August,
Yeah.
September. Yeah, you covered a lot of ground, and I'm sure people have questions. So let's take any questions from the audience. You can unmute yourself or raise your hand. Please, Amale, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah,
Yes.
great. Thank you, Maya, for your excellent presentation. Quite a lot to digest there. Just your neighbor next to us with Ilya Pangrat's chair at LMU. We're also doing something related to that. I was just curious, how do you estimate your response rate, or the response or the recovery rate?
The restoring rate,
Yes,
yeah.
the restoring rate.
You can give different names for it, totally. Sort of lambda. So basically, what I use is the method that Niklas introduced in BORS 2021, where the restoring rate calculation accounts for, changing autocorrelation, because basically you just regress the sort of changes in time like delta x against x, but you use a sort of special regression function that accounts for changing autocorrelation.
Okay, but then essentially you describe these as what the response or the restoration would be if there was no AMOC collapse.
Sorry?
Would you describe this as what it takes for the system to come back to stability, or assuming there was no AMOC collapse?
Yeah, so the restoring rate is like this. I have to go past. This is the issue with having so many slides. Yeah, so the restoring rate, I think I have it here, right? It's the sort of like, basically this is a negative value and it's becoming more positive, so it's becoming smaller. Basically, like the restoring rate from perturbations is getting smaller, which means that the recovery time for perturbations increases, the autocorrelation increases. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's yeah, that makes sense. That's great. Thank you.
Cool.
Peter.
Peter Ashton.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, very nice talk. Thank you very much. One question I have is, if we could calculate the time of tipping, what would it be? Is this basically when the restoring rate goes positive? And is that actually an indication of, what can we actually infer from that?
Yeah, so in this sort of like, actually it's good that I'm already on this slide, because in this sort of, a perfect system like this like double fold, the restoring rate would basically go to 0 when you get to this bifurcation point, right? Like here you have a negative number and it basically would cross 0 around this point. You can see that even in this toy model, it doesn't exactly do that because you always have some noise or something, but that is what you would get. The sort of like, in a perfect theoretical model, you do get the point at which the system crosses the critical threshold, the bifurcation point. Obviously, for the AMOC, this is a lot more complicated. So I guess if we could calculate it, it might be the point at which the AMOC crosses this, but as you know well, like we're not, the AMOC is moving much faster than sort of something like this, right? It's not at equilibrium. So whether or not the point at which you cross the sort of like the restoring rate gets to 0 is also the point at which you sort of get to the sort of point of no return. I think that's another problem with this, right? That it's sort of like it works in a very sort of idealized case.
A question from Richard Wood.
Yeah, hi Maya, thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah, hi, thanks. I really enjoyed that talk. I was actually going to ask a similar question to Pete Ashwin around. I think there's a communication issue here, isn't there? Because in terms of timescales, if we could make a prediction, that those predicted times are not necessarily the times when the AMOC would actually go to 0, and I think sometimes they can be interpreted in the kind of sphere as that. So, but maybe I can just ask a slightly different question. So going back to the impacts section of the talk. Obviously, traditionally, we've assessed the impacts of an AMOC collapse in isolation by doing these hosing runs in pre-industrial control climates. And a question that I know we often get asked by sort of public and policy people is, yeah, but what does that mean when you add it to the overall impacts of global warming? So in ClimTip, we're doing some experiments where we do hosing in a warmer climate. But I just wonder whether from any of the work that you've done, particularly looking at the monsoon regions, how does the changes that arise from the AMOC shutdown that you looked at compare with the kind of changes in precipitation that you'd see from typical climate change simulation?
Yes. So I actually don't have this figure here, but in a way, if you just look at sort of like the overall change, sometimes you even see something sort of opposite to the impact from climate change in like monsoon change, where here you have less rainfall and more, and then from climate change you have sort of more rainfall sort of around the center and less rainfall and top and bottom or something. But in general, as you probably know, there's not that much agreement between models on sort of the impacts on rainfall from climate change, which is also why we sort of found this agreement on between the models on the hosing impacts nice, because you can see for something like here in the southern Amazon box, for example, the geographical and monthly agreement between the 4 models in these warming experiments is quite low, and it's high in the sort of like AMOC 1. So obviously that's not because, I don't know, the models are better or anything, it's just because it's a simpler physical process that is going on, just a southward shift of the tropical rain belt. But it's more difficult to say exactly how the hosing impacts would combine with warming, especially on something like a seasonal cycle, and definitely just, having hosing experiments like you describe would be very useful. I think there's already like a paper by Katinka Belomo and Oliver Melling on something about how the changes, I think not an AMOC collapse, but a weakening is sort of state dependent, given on sort of, is it happening in a warming climate or just a simple hosing? So that will be interesting to look at.
Yeah, indeed. So I really like that plot because at least it shows that taking into account the AMOC effects, it's going to make the whole question of predicting what precipitation is going to do more difficult, but it doesn't make it that much more difficult.
Exactly. Yeah, at least that's something we understand, right? The warming stuff is a bit more difficult, but the AMOC impacts seem a bit clear.
It's a bit more robust. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very
exactly.
Maybe I can read. Go ahead, Maya.
Oh, I was just going to comment on the sort of first part of Richard's question about the sort of tipping definition, just to say that I also think there is some confusion in what we mean when we say tipping, and even in sort of, in finding an indicator. for what is tipping. Sometimes there's a confusion about, are we finding something that tells us when we cross the bifurcation point? Is it when the AMOC goes into a bistable region? Is it when we sort of get to a completely collapsed sort of weak AMOC? So yeah, it is useful to define what you're talking about when you talk about tipping.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Thanks.
I also very much agree. So there's a question, well, actually 2 questions in the chat, now 3. But by Jasper, I'm gonna separate them into 2. Maya, at which point could it be possible to establish the tipping point has been passed?
That is a difficult question, right? For all of the reasons that we've already been discussing, that the fact that the AMOC is not some sort of perfect theoretical system that is constantly in equilibrium. So something like roughly saying the AMOC has been losing stability is something we can do. But even if we sort of continue to monitor, you know, this increase in the restoring rate and we get to a time when it crosses 0, even then it's not like we can exactly say, oh, the AMOC has like definitely crossed the tipping point now. I think it's probably, a different approach to this, of course, is to also sort of like study the AMOC in models and sort of try to determine like a range for when does the AMOC cross this sort of point of no return in the models, and then sort of combine these different approaches, both monitoring the AMOC and also understanding when the sort of like boundaries are. And then you can get sort of like evidence from multiple sources and maybe make the conclusion stronger.
All right, and then the second part of that question, how would the instability on the way affect livability on in the climatic zones, so be important to predict in itself?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
How would the instability on the way affect livability in the climatic zones? So be important. Yeah, okay, there's a something wrong in the grammar here. So be important to predict in itself. But I guess sort of the question is, how important is it to predict when we're getting into the instability, as opposed to sort of when the tipping point is? No, but that also doesn't. To predict if we're already in the sort of in the tipping situation, I guess.
I guess maybe the reason the question is confusing is because of the sort of vague definition of stability, instability, right? Where sometimes I find that I talk about, oh, the AMOC is losing stability, and it's not exactly clear what that means. It's just as we get closer to the tipping point, the system is less stable in that it takes it longer to recover from perturbations, right? If we have like a warmer year or like an El Nino, La Nina year or something like that, the perturbation in the AMOC strength might be bigger, like, you know, the sort of like variability. And obviously that would also, I guess, mean larger variability in different sort of like places in the earth, right? Sort of as the AMOC changes, that also affects climate. But I think with climate change is already really affecting extremes and variability everywhere on the globe. So it might be difficult to sort of disentangle these. And I guess the other side of this increasing in instability is that we are getting closer to the tipping point. So we're getting closer to a place where just a small increase in temperature or something like that could cause an AMOC collapse. But yeah, I hope that answers the question.
I guess so. So final question, because we're already over time. Final question: is the AMOC collapse due to ice melting from climate change? And following the precautionary principle, what should we do? My guess is to stop. But sort of the guess of the person asking is to stop burning upwards of 100 million barrels of oil a day globally. I guess that's a good start.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a great start. So as I said sort of here at the start, the reason that the AMOC is weakening is sort of like a combination of factors. Actually, so far in the historical period, I don't think melting ice from example, from Greenland has been such a big effect. You already have warming, which, you know, and more rainfall, and melting of sea ice, which means the waters are lighter. But in the future, obviously, melting ice sheets are a really big worry, because that could add a lot of fresh water to the North Atlantic. So about what we should do, yeah, the sort of question of the AMOC is always more like difficult to give a sort of take home message from it, because at the end of the day, it's a big system, and the best we can do to not have the AMOC collapse is just not have climate change be that bad, right? It's the same sort of like message that you give for everything, which is we need to reduce emissions and not have global warming cross whatever 2 degrees or some value, as little warming as possible. But yes, people always want something more direct. I gave a talk once where someone asked me, could we actually pour salt into the North Atlantic to like make the AMOC faster? And then my friends and I did a sort of like back of the envelope calculation and found that you would need to have 30 times more salt than we have on the whole planet to make the AMOC over like 50 years or something, to make the AMOC not slow down. So yeah, unfortunately, there's no direct way. We just need to do the very difficult task of reducing emissions.
All right. I mean, there's a lot of very positive feedback. So people enjoyed this a lot. Very nice. Also from my side, thank you very much again, Maya.